empire wasn't some kind of accident. It didn't just stumble into existence. No, it was built with a playbook, a set of tried and true tactics for conquest and control. And the very first draft of that playbook, it was written, tested, and perfected right next door in its very first colony, Ireland.
This quote right here, it really gets to the heart of what we're talking about. This isn't just a history lesson. It's the story of a blueprint, a formula for empire, and how Ireland became the original testing ground for the whole thing.
And we're not talking about a few isolated incidents. We're talking about a systematic approach that was refined over hundreds and hundreds of years. Think land confiscation, engineered famines, cultural erasure. The methods used to control the Irish became the model, the go-to strategy, for British colonial rule just about everywhere.
So, first things first, let's set the stage. To really get this, we have to understand that England's colonization of Ireland wasn't a one-and-done event. It was a slow, centuries-long process that laid the groundwork for everything that came after.
I mean, just look at this timeline. The sheer scale of it is pretty staggering. It all kicks off with the English invasion way back in the 12th century. Fast forward to the 1500s, and you get the plantation system, which is basically a nice way of saying they kicked the native Irish off their land to plant loyal Protestant settlers. Then in the 1690s, things get even more systematic with the Penal Laws, which basically wrote oppression into the legal code. This whole process stretches all the way into the 20th century, ending with the island being literally cut in two.
So, what exactly was in this playbook of control? Well, it was filled with specific, and more importantly, replicable tactics, all designed to break a people's spirit and their will to fight back. Let's break down some of the key strategies.
Okay, at the absolute core of this playbook were the Penal Laws, and these weren't just a bunch of unfair rules. No, you have to think of them as a deliberate project of social engineering. They were built to create a rigid caste system based on religion, with the goal of making Irish Catholics completely powerless. No land, no voice, no power. It was, for all intents and purposes, cultural genocide carried out with a pen and a gavel.
And this slide, this is where you can really see how the playbook got copied and pasted around the world. The parallels are just undeniable. The tactic of land theft in Ireland, you see echoes of that in the Black Codes after the Civil War and in apartheid South Africa. Banning Catholic schools, which led to secret hedge schools popping up, that's a direct forerunner to the indigenous boarding schools in North America, designed for forced assimilation. Taking away legal and political rights from Catholics, well, that became a core feature of Jim Crow in the US and apartheid. It really drives home the point. Colonizers don't often invent new methods of oppression, they just replicate what's worked before.
But the playbook went beyond just laws. It also turned the most basic human need into a weapon: food. You see, a famine in the empire was rarely just a natural disaster. It was a tool.
Take the Great Famine. A potato blight hits and wipes out Ireland's main food source. A tragedy, right? But here's the thing. It wasn't just about a crop failure. While over 1 million Irish men, women, and children starved to death, historical records show that ships packed with grain, with cattle, with food were leaving Irish ports every single day, sailing for Britain. It wasn't just a famine. It was a catastrophic policy decision.
And then, almost a century later, the same play was run again. In 1943, during the Bengal famine, Britain diverted massive amounts of food away from the local population to support its own wartime needs. The result? Over 3 million people died. The same pattern, the same playbook, just with an even more devastating outcome.
So, beyond laws and starvation, there was this other, more subtle weapon: language. See, to justify colonization, you have to dehumanize the people you're colonizing. You have to paint them as uncivilized, dirty, basically incapable of ruling themselves.
I mean, listen to this quote from a British reverend in the 1850s. Squalid, loathsome in the extreme. He's not describing their poverty with sympathy. He's describing the people themselves with pure disgust. This is the kind of language that makes subjugation seem, well, natural, almost necessary.
And here's where the story takes a really tragic turn. Less than 100 years later, you have an Irish missionary in Africa using almost the exact same kind of dehumanizing language to describe the local people, the heart of the savage. It's a chilling example of how the colonized can sometimes end up adopting the toxic language of their colonizer. It shows you just how deep these ideas can run. But here's the thing about oppression. It always breeds resistance. And just like the colonial playbook was shared across the empire, so were the strategies for fighting back. The Irish struggle became a source of inspiration for people all over the world.
These connections are so profound.
Nelson Mandela himself spoke about the parallels between the Irish fight for freedom and the anti-apartheid movement. The hunger strike, that powerful tool of resistance used so famously by Irish Republicans like Bobby Sands, was later adopted by Palestinian prisoners. And even the oppressors were shared. Britain's notorious paramilitary force, the Black and Tans, cut their teeth in Ireland before being sent to Palestine.
And if you want one life story that perfectly captures this whole tangled web, it's Roger Casement. This guy was a knighted British diplomat, a hero who exposed horrific colonial abuses in the Congo and the Amazon. But seeing imperialism up close changed him. It radicalized him. He realized the same brutal system hurting people over there was hurting his own people back home in Ireland. So he became an Irish revolutionary, and in 1916, he was executed for treason by the very same empire that had once celebrated him.
By the middle of the 20th century, though, the old playbook was starting to fall apart. In 1960, the British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan gave this famous Wind of Change speech. He was basically admitting that the age of empire was coming to an end. National liberation movements were
Famously by Irish Republicans like Bobby Sands, was later adopted by Palestinian prisoners. And even the oppressors were shared. Britain's notorious paramilitary force, the Black and Tans, cut their teeth in Ireland before being sent to Palestine.
And if you want one life story that perfectly captures this whole tangled web, it's Roger Casement. This guy was a knighted British diplomat, a hero who exposed horrific colonial abuses in the Congo and the Amazon. But seeing imperialism up close changed him. It radicalized him. He realized the same brutal system hurting people over there was hurting his own people back home in Ireland. So he became an Irish revolutionary, and in 1916, he was executed for treason by the very same empire that had once celebrated him.
By the middle of the 20th century, though, the old playbook was starting to fall apart. In 1960, the British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan gave this famous Wind of Change speech. He was basically admitting that the age of empire was coming to an end. National liberation movements were sweeping across Africa and the world, and the struggles that had started in places like Ireland were finally coming to fruition on a global scale.
So, what this history really shows us is that systems of oppression are rarely accidental. They're designed, they're tested, they're replicated. So, if a playbook for domination can be written and spread across the entire globe, it leaves us with a pretty big question, doesn't it? What does it take for us to write a new one? A playbook for liberation, for equity, and for justice?